Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna 465 chainsaw. Customer complaint is that he thinks it needs a new carb. Now that's very important, and we're going to come back to that complaint. So the first thing I'm going to do is look in the fuel tank, because why? That's the first thing I always do. You never know what you might find in there. Maybe it's straight gas, maybe there's water, maybe the fuel filter is laying in the bottom, maybe it's old gas. What goes in the tank is very important. So let's take a look here. Right now the fuel's a little bit foggy, but I'm getting the feeling that there might be some moisture in there. Let's look in the tank. You know, if there's water in there, a lot of times you can see the droplets rolling around in the bottom of the tank, even after you poured most of the fuel out. I'm going to pressure test this fuel line. I'm going to put 10 pounds of pressure on here and see if it holds. And it is holding that 10 pounds of pressure. That tells me that the fuel line doesn't have any holes in it and the carburetor is tight. So you saw we took an orange filter off and we're putting a blue filter on because this is an auto-tune saw and auto-tune saws call for a blue filter. The line kind of had a memory on the end, so I'm just snipping it clean and pushing that filter on there tight. We'll get the cap on here and we'll come back to this. Yeah, I made a big mess. So the next thing I always do is I look in the cylinder. Now, yeah, I did put a new filter on here already, and if I find the cylinder is scored, I'll have to go back and recover that filter. But you got to do everything in a certain order, and you got to pick that order, and you got to do it like that every time. And what I've picked is to look in the fuel tank first, and then the cylinder. Now, there are cases where the customer complaint leads me to checking the cylinder first, but when I don't know what the story is, this is the way I do it. Cylinder looks clean, so we're off the hook anyway. So he's complaining that he thinks it needs a carb. At least that's what the work order says. And I thought the fuel looked a little foggy, so I'm just going to tap a little bit of fuel out of this funnel. And if there's water in it, it will have settled to the bottom. So let's take a look. Show everybody. If I pour a little bit of the fuel out, it'll be easier to see. You see that big brown puddle in the bottom? That is rusty water. It's not a huge amount of water, but if that water starts getting picked up by the filter and goes into the carburetor, it certainly could create problems. You could be blocking the micro screen, you could be sucking that water in, you could be creating some kind of scum inside the carburetor. They're not designed to run on water, so any water that's in there is bad. So now that I know that there's water in the system, I'm going to pull that carburetor and take a deeper look. I noticed that the air filter looks nice. I noticed that the throat of the air filter box is clean. Doesn't look like it sucked any debris in. But I think before I open up that carburetor, I'm going to see if there's any error codes stored in this auto-tune system. Now this box right here is part of the Husqvarna service hub. This is the newest version of the interface between a computer and a saw, or any other Husky equipment that you can hook up to a computer. So there's a serial cable on one end and a USB on the other, We plug it into the computer, pull up the software, and what I see on here is that there's two error codes. One says come down offset max rich, and the other one, I missed it. What did it say? Idle max rich. So we can look at each one of these codes individually, and it gives us clues. One thing is that the throttle air valve is not completely closed. One asks us to do a leak down test, leakage in the engine. And the last one there, it says the fuel contains 25% alcohol. Okay. So let's look at the other error code and see if any of these overlap. So here's the second code. When we look at the details, it wants us to pressure test the engine. It says right there, leakage in the engine. And the last one is the fuel quality, alcohol was too high. So we're blaming ethanol. And certainly ethanol draws moisture right out of the air, so if he's storing his fuel in an open can, that could explain the water. But while I'm in here, I wanted to check for a firmware update, and that last screen just showed what the current firmware was that was in the saw and what it would update it to, and both those versions were the same, so we didn't have to update it. So I'm going to really speed through a lot of this here. Basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull the carburetor, and we're going to take a closer look and see if there's any evidence of water damage inside the carb. I've got a lot of videos out there that show how to do this process, so I'm just buzzing through this. If I didn't, this would be a half-hour video. So I'm pulling the cover off the metering diaphragm side of the carburetor, and what I find is that it's in really good shape. I don't remember how old this saw is, but there's nothing wrong with this metering diaphragm. And I guess I never expected there to be anything wrong with it, but I want to look at it. So we'll put this right back together. Alright, hurry up. And we're looking at the other side of the carburetor. We want to access the fuel pump and the micro screen. The fuel pump diaphragm looks fine. I can see a tiny bubble of that rusty water sitting on top of the micro screen. And there's a big reflection there, but you can barely see that little dot of fuel rolling around it, or little dot of water rolling around in there. So I know that the carb was sucking up some water. It was going through the engine. Auto-tune probably was affected by that, and that's why we saw those error codes. It's not a lot of water. The other error code I saw that overlapped was leakage in the engine. If the thing's sucking air, it's not going to run right, and that could explain why the customer thought it needed a new carburetor. I mean, he's not the mechanic, that's why he brought it to me, right? So what we have to do, and this is the same on any two-cycle engine that you want to pressure test, you have to block off the intake, you have to block off the exhaust, and you have to block off the spark plug hole, or put your adapter in there where you're going to put the air in or suck the vacuum from. And that's the way I do it with a Husqvarna. Now there are some other setups where the intake block off plate has the adapter in it for your pump, and you just leave the spark plug in. So you can see I got a lot of plates for exhaust. And for whatever reason, the one I wanted was like the last place I looked, right? So it's important to note here that my procedure of reading the work order and just starting it on the repair without a test run You know, it might have bit me in the butt on this one. Here we're putting a pressure into the crankcase, putting 7 pounds in it. We let it sit there for minutes and it never moved. And now we're pulling a vacuum and we're finding that the engine is tight, so it does not have an air leak. All of those suggestions on the errors that we saw in the software, you know, they can't pin it down exactly. There was water in the fuel, but some of these symptoms overlap. So we ruled out the pressure test problem or leakage in the crankcase. Now when I test ran this saw, it ran perfect. I dropped it in a log and the chain stopped. What the heck? I flipped the saw over and the chain had been installed alongside the rim drive and not in the grooves of the rim drive. I called the customer and asked him why he thought it needed a carburetor, and he said, I never said carburetor, I said clutch. I talked to the coworker who wrote the work order, and the coworker said the customer was in a hurry. He told me he thought it needed a new carb, and he left. So that's what they wrote down. It needed a new carb. I could have test ran it and turned this 30-minute waste of time into a 5-minute repair. If I would have test ran it first, then I would have seen that right away. So who's at fault here? I mean, I'm not going to point any fingers. We got the saw back into the customer's hands and it's all good. But I guess, what procedure would you have used? Do you always test run saws first? Let me put it to you like this. I lost 30 minutes on this repair, but if I test ran every saw that came across my bench and it took 5 minutes, 10 minutes to test run them, at the end of the month, I would have so much time invested in those test runs, way more than 30 minutes. So the occasional screw up on someone's part, it doesn't equal changing my procedure to test run everything first. I could avoid 1 or 2 situations like this as opposed to just jumping into it and finding the problem and fixing it. So let me know how you would have done it. That's all I'm going to have for you on the Husqvarna 465 chainsaw that needed a new carb. Thanks for watching. Later.